At dawn on a quiet summer morning in June 1941, the illusion of peace along the eastern borders of Europe collapsed without warning. Columns of German tanks rolled forward, aircraft filled the skies, and artillery fire echoed across thousands of kilometers. In a single moment, the Soviet Union found itself facing an invasion so vast that it would redefine the meaning of modern warfare. What followed was not merely a military campaign, but a struggle for survival that would place the Soviet Union at the very center of World War II and ultimately determine its outcome. Before the invasion, the Soviet Union had tried to delay direct involvement in the war. Diplomatic agreements and strategic caution reflected a desire to avoid confrontation while strengthening internal defenses. However, ideological hostility and competing ambitions made conflict unavoidable. When German forces crossed into Soviet territory, the scale of the assault shocked the world. Entire regions were overrun, communication lines collapsed, and Soviet armies suffered catastrophic losses. Observers both inside and outside the country questioned whether the Soviet state could withstand such pressure. Yet collapse did not come. Instead, the Soviet Union demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to absorb shock and reorganize itself under extreme conditions. The invasion transformed the war into a national emergency that touched every aspect of life. Government authority tightened, society mobilized, and the economy was redirected entirely toward defense. The war was no longer fought only by soldiers at the front, it became a collective effort involving millions of civilians. One of the most remarkable responses was the rapid relocation of industry. Factories from threatened regions were dismantled and transported eastward, where production resumed under harsh conditions. Workers labored long hours with limited resources, driven by urgency rather than comfort. This industrial shift ensured a steady flow of weapons and equipment even as territory was lost. Over time, this ability to sustain production became a decisive advantage. Geography played a silent but powerful role in shaping events. The vast size of the Soviet Union stretched enemy supply lines and slowed advances. Long distances, poor infrastructure, and unfamiliar terrain turned early success into logistical strain. As seasons changed, conditions grew harsher. Extreme cold, snow, and ice tested endurance and exposed weaknesses in preparation. Soviet forces, accustomed to the environment, learned to fight within it rather than against it. The human dimension of the Soviet war effort was immense. Soldiers were often poorly equipped in the early stages, yet they continued to fight with determination. Civilians endured shortages, displacement, and constant fear, while still contributing to the war effort. Women took on roles in factories, farms, and medical units, while young people filled gaps left by those at the front. The line between civilian and soldier blurred as survival depended on collective resilience. As the war continued, Soviet military effectiveness improved. Experience reshaped leadership and tactics, turning early mistakes into lessons. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery grew stronger, and planning became more disciplined. Quantity combined with adaptability, allowing Soviet forces to sustain operations on a scale that few nations could match. The ability to replace losses, both in manpower and equipment, gradually shifted the balance. The Soviet Union also became the primary focus of German military commitment. The majority of enemy forces were drawn into prolonged fighting across eastern territories, where casualties mounted rapidly. This constant pressure weakened the overall war effort of Germany and limited its ability to respond elsewhere. The conflict in the East became a war of endurance, and endurance favored the side capable of continuous mobilization. The cost of this effort was staggering. Entire cities were reduced to ruins, agricultural regions devastated, and millions of lives lost. Families were separated, cultures disrupted, and generations scarred by violence. Despite this suffering, the war was framed as a defense of homeland and identity, strengthening resolve rather than breaking it. Memory and sacrifice became powerful forces sustaining resistance through the darkest moments. Gradually, momentum shifted. Defensive actions turned into counteroffensives, and lost ground was reclaimed. The Soviet advance westward was steady and relentless, driven by accumulated strength and strategic confidence. Each success reinforced the sense that victory, once unimaginable, was now achievable. The war transformed from a desperate defense into a determined pursuit of final defeat. By the final stages of the conflict, Soviet forces were no longer fighting solely to protect their own territory. Their advance reshaped the political landscape of Europe, determining borders and governments in the post-war era. When fighting reached the heart of Germany, it symbolized the complete reversal of fortune that had begun years earlier with invasion and retreat. When the war in Europe finally ended, the Soviet Union emerged victorious but deeply wounded. Its role had been central and unavoidable. The defeat of Nazi Germany had come at an immense cost, but it also elevated the Soviet Union to a position of global power. The experience of war shaped its identity, policies, and international relations for decades to come. In the final analysis, the role of the Soviet Union in World War II cannot be reduced to a single battle or campaign. It was a continuous struggle defined by sacrifice, adaptation, and endurance. From the shock of invasion to the triumph of victory, the Soviet Union stood at the core of the conflict, transforming the course of the war and the history of the 20th century. The Eastern Front in World War II. When World War II is remembered for its scale and destruction, the images that most clearly define its intensity come not from the beaches of Normandy or the deserts of North Africa, but from the vast and unforgiving lands of Eastern Europe. It was here, across endless plains, frozen rivers, and shattered cities, that the Eastern Front emerged as the most decisive and brutal arena of the war. More than any other battlefield, it became the place where the conflict consumed entire societies and where the outcome of the war in Europe was ultimately decided. The Eastern Front came into existence in the summer of 1941 when German forces launched a massive invasion of Soviet territory. This was not a limited military operation but a campaign of extraordinary ambition and violence. The scale of the attack was unprecedented, involving millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks and aircraft. The front stretched across thousands of kilometers, creating a battlefield so large that it challenged traditional ideas of command, control, and supply. From the very beginning, it was clear that this would be a war without limits. Unlike other fronts, the Eastern Front was shaped as much by geography as by strategy. The sheer size of the region placed enormous pressure on both armies. Roads were few, railways were unreliable, and distances between key locations were vast. Every advance created new logistical problems, as supplies struggled to keep pace with moving forces. Success depended not only on winning battles but on maintaining the ability to move, feed, and equip armies across hostile terrain. The nature of the conflict on the Eastern Front was exceptionally harsh. Fighting was driven by ideology as well as military objectives, resulting in widespread brutality. Entire communities were uprooted, and civilian populations were caught directly in the violence. Cities became battlegrounds, villages were destroyed, and agricultural regions were stripped bare. The war blurred the distinction between front lines and home fronts, turning daily survival into a constant struggle for millions of people. Environmental conditions added another layer of difficulty. Summers brought dust, heat, and exhaustion, while autumn rains turned roads into thick mud that immobilized vehicles. Winters were especially severe, bringing freezing temperatures that tested the limits of human endurance. Equipment failed, food supplies froze, and exposure claimed countless lives. These conditions shaped military decisions and often determined the pace and outcome of operations. As the fighting continued, the Eastern Front evolved into a war of attrition. Losses mounted at an extraordinary rate, and battles often resulted in heavy casualties without immediate strategic gain. Victory increasingly depended on the ability to replace men and material over time. This long, grinding struggle favored endurance and organization over speed and surprise. Armies were forced to adapt or collapse under the strain. Urban warfare became a defining feature of the Eastern Front. Large cities turned into symbols of resistance and destruction. Streets, factories, and apartment buildings were transformed into defensive positions. Fighting in these environments was slow and exhausting, often occurring at close range and lasting for months. The destruction of urban centers reflected the intensity of the conflict and left lasting scars on the landscape and its people. The Eastern Front also played a central role in shaping the broader course of World War II. The concentration of fighting in the East absorbed the majority of German military resources. This imbalance weakened Germany's ability to respond effectively on other fronts, indirectly influencing events across Europe. Decisions made in Eastern Europe had consequences that reached far beyond the region itself. Over time, the balance of power on the Eastern Front began to shift. Initial advances gave way to prolonged resistance and eventual counteroffensives. Momentum changed gradually rather than suddenly, shaped by cumulative pressure rather than single victories. Each phase of the fighting built upon the last, creating a continuous cycle of attack, defense, and recovery. As armies pushed westward, the Eastern Front became not only a military struggle but also a political one. Control over territory carried implications for future governance and influence. Advancing forces were not simply reclaiming land, they were reshaping the political map of Europe. The movement of the front line foreshadowed the division of the continent that would emerge after the war. The final stages of the Eastern Front brought the conflict into the heart of Germany. Resistance intensified as defeat became inevitable. Urban combat reached new levels of destruction, and the human cost continued to rise. The end came not through a single decisive blow but through the cumulative effect of years of sustained fighting and exhaustion. When the fighting finally ceased, the Eastern Front had left behind a transformed continent. Tens of millions had died, entire regions lay in ruins, and societies faced the challenge of rebuilding from near total destruction. The front had consumed resources, lives, and time on a scale unmatched by any other theater of the war. In historical perspective, the Eastern Front stands as the central battlefield of World War II in Europe. Its scale, intensity, and consequences set it apart from all other fronts. It was here that the war reached its most extreme form and where its outcome was ultimately determined. The legacy of the Eastern Front continues to shape historical memory, serving as a powerful reminder of the cost of total war. The importance of the Battle of Stalingrad. On the banks of the Volga River stood a city that would soon become the turning point of the deadliest war in human history. In 1942, Stalingrad was not just another name on a military map, it was a symbol, a target, and eventually a graveyard for ambition. What unfolded there was a battle so intense and unforgiving that it reshaped the course of World War II. The Battle of Stalingrad marked the moment when the direction of the war changed decisively, ending the momentum of Nazi expansion and opening the path toward its eventual defeat. The struggle for Stalingrad emerged from a broader campaign aimed at securing strategic advantage in southern Europe. The city's location along a major river route made it critical for transportation and supply, while nearby regions held resources essential for sustaining prolonged warfare. Beyond its practical value, the city carried enormous symbolic significance. Capturing a city associated with Soviet leadership was meant to deal a psychological blow and demonstrate dominance. For the defenders, losing it was unthinkable. The assault began with overwhelming force. Heavy bombardment reduced much of the city to rubble, destroying homes, factories, and infrastructure. Yet this destruction did not deliver the quick victory that had been expected. Instead, the ruins transformed the battlefield into a maze of broken buildings and debris, where conventional tactics lost their effectiveness. Tanks and large formations became less useful, and combat shifted into close, exhausting confrontations fought room by room and floor by floor. What followed was a battle defined by endurance rather than speed. Fighting continued day and night, often without clear front lines. Control over a single building or street could change repeatedly, sometimes within hours. Soldiers endured constant danger, lack of rest, and extreme shortages. The psychological pressure was immense, as survival depended on holding ground under relentless attack. The city itself seemed to absorb the violence, standing battered but unconquered. As the fighting dragged on, the attackers faced growing difficulties. Supply routes stretched thin, and maintaining consistent support for troops inside the city became increasingly challenging. Losses mounted, and the cost of every gain rose sharply. Meanwhile, the defenders adapted to the conditions, using the terrain to their advantage and preventing any decisive breakthrough. Time began to favor resistance rather than aggression. The decisive moment came not from within the shattered city but from actions beyond it. A carefully planned counteroffensive targeted vulnerable positions outside the urban area, cutting off the main attacking force from reinforcement and retreat. This shift transformed the battle entirely. What had been an offensive campaign became a desperate struggle to survive under encirclement. Surrounded forces faced worsening conditions as supplies dwindled and morale collapsed. Attempts to reverse the situation proved ineffective, and the harsh winter intensified suffering. Strategic decisions that prioritized prestige over practicality deepened the crisis. Gradually, resistance weakened as exhaustion and hunger took their toll. The surrender that followed shocked the world, marking the first complete destruction of a major field army during the war. The importance of the Battle of Stalingrad lies first in its military consequences. It ended the pattern of uninterrupted advances and forced a fundamental change in strategy. From this point onward, the initiative shifted permanently. Defensive operations replaced expansion, and long-term survival became the primary concern. The balance of power on the battlefield had changed. Equally significant was the psychological impact. The battle shattered the belief that victory was inevitable and restored confidence to those resisting domination. It demonstrated that determination, patience, and strategic depth could overcome even the most formidable force. Morale surged among opposing forces, while confidence among attackers suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered. The political consequences of Stalingrad were also profound. The outcome strengthened cooperation among opposing powers and influenced strategic planning across multiple regions. It altered diplomatic calculations and reinforced the perception that the war's outcome was no longer predetermined. The battle reshaped expectations and encouraged a shift toward coordinated long-term efforts. Beyond strategy and politics, Stalingrad became a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. The scale of suffering endured by both soldiers and civilians was immense. The city was left devastated, its population shattered by loss and displacement. Yet its defense came to represent the capacity of a society to endure extreme hardship without surrendering purpose. Memory of the battle became a powerful force in shaping national identity and historical consciousness. The effects of Stalingrad extended far beyond its immediate aftermath. Subsequent operations built upon the momentum created there, leading to a steady advance that would eventually reach the heart of enemy territory. The battle marked the moment when the direction of the war became irreversible. Every major development that followed carried the imprint of what had been decided on the Volga. In historical perspective, the Battle of Stalingrad stands as more than a single engagement. It represents the point at which ambition met its limits and endurance reshaped destiny. The city's ruins became a symbol of resistance, and its outcome altered the rhythm of the entire conflict. From that moment onward, the war followed a different path. In conclusion, the importance of the Battle of Stalingrad lies in its ability to change history. It transformed military strategy, reshaped morale, influenced political outcomes, and redefined the meaning of victory and defeat. More than any other battle, it marked the turning point of World War II, ensuring that the forces of expansion would be pushed back and that the course of the 20th century would take a new direction.